In May of 1968, a group of New York real estate developers paid for a full-page advertisement in the New York Times. It showed an artist's rendering of a commercial jetliner, seconds from impact, flying straight into the upper floors of the World Trade Center. The ad was meant to kill the project. The buildings, the developers argued, were too tall, too dangerous, too close to the flight paths out of LaGuardia and JFK. The towers would wreck the real estate market, endanger aviation, and create a disaster no one could contain. The man behind the ad was Lawrence Wien, co-owner of the Empire State Building, and he had rounded up nearly every major real estate power in Midtown to stand behind him. They spent years and enormous sums trying to stop the World Trade Center from being built. They failed. The towers went up anyway. And 33 years later, on a Tuesday morning in September, the very scenario Wien had warned about came true, not by accident, but by design, in a manner so monstrous that no newspaper ad could have imagined it. That is the short version, but the long version is stranger and sadder, and begins not with the towers at all, but with a neighborhood that almost nobody alive today remembers. If you had walked down Cortlandt Street in Lower Manhattan on any Saturday in the 1950s, you would have thought you had stumbled into an open-air bazaar. The sidewalks were so packed with bins of radio tubes, coils of copper wire, tangled headphone cables, and surplus military electronics that you could barely push through. The shops had names like Oscar's Radio, National Radio, and Bargain Electronics, and they spilled their inventory right onto the pavement. Inside, ham radio enthusiasts argued with shopkeepers over the price of a vacuum tube. Hobbyists who'd driven from Philadelphia, Hartford, or Baltimore rummaged through boxes of capacitors. This was Radio Row, roughly 13 blocks of small independent shops stretching from Day Street down to Liberty between Church and West Broadway. It was not glamorous. The buildings were old. The signage was chaotic. City planners looked at it the way a surgeon looks at a mole. But by the mid-1950s, Radio Row represented something like 400 shops, over 1,000 small businesses and offices when you counted the surrounding blocks, an estimated 30,000 employees, and annual business volume that some claimed reached $300 million. It was, by any measure, a functioning commercial ecosystem, messy, profitable, and thoroughly alive. Radio Row had been there since 1921, when a shop called City Radio opened on Cortlandt Street and attracted enough foot traffic that competitors moved in beside it. The clustering effect took hold. Within a few years, every storefront in the neighborhood seemed to be selling radios, then televisions, then hi-fi equipment. By the time the transistor era arrived, Radio Row had become the largest concentration of electronics retailers in the world. Customers came from hundreds of miles away to find parts no one else carried. A 1962 profile in the New York Times called it one of the city's oldest, most vital, and most colorful commercial centers. It was, in many ways, the kind of place that people in the 21st century romanticize. A dense, organic, human-scale market district that had grown not from any master plan, but from the simple logic of merchants wanting to be near other merchants. None of them had any idea that they were sitting on the most consequential 16 acres in American real estate history. The idea for a World Trade Center first surfaced at the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows. A group of business and trade associations built an exhibit promoting the concept of world peace through world trade, and afterward, a few prominent New Yorkers began asking whether the concept could become permanent. The most enthusiastic was Winthrop Aldrich, chairman of Chase National Bank. In 1946, the New York State Legislature created a World Trade Center Corporation to study the feasibility of a permanent trade complex. After looking at the numbers, the corporation concluded the state's money would be better spent improving the city's ports. The idea went dormant for a decade. It was revived by Aldrich's nephew, a man whose name would run through this story like rebar through concrete, David Rockefeller. The grandson of Standard Oil founder John D. Rockefeller David had become a leader at Chase Manhattan Bank, and by the mid-1950s he was deeply worried about Lower Manhattan. The financial district was stagnating. Not a single major office building had gone up downtown between 1929 and the early 1950s. Of the nearly 150 office buildings constructed in Manhattan during that period, fewer than 30 were built below Canal Street. The action had moved to Midtown. Companies were following their employees to the suburbs. Wall Street, once the unquestioned center of American finance, was starting to feel like a backwater with good architecture. David Rockefeller decided to fight. In 1955, he announced that Chase Manhattan would build its new headquarters in Lower Manhattan, a 60-story tower at a cost of $121 million. It was a bold bet. But one building wasn't enough to reverse the tide, and Rockefeller knew it. In 1958, he founded the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association and assembled a coalition of business and real estate leaders to come up with a sweeping revitalization plan. At the center of it, right at the heart of his ambition, was the idea Aldrich had floated a decade earlier, a World Trade Center. In January 1960, the association released its formal plan, a 5 million square foot complex on the east side of Manhattan near the South Street seaport. The plan called for a 70-story office tower, an international trade mart, an exhibition hall, and a securities exchange. The estimated cost was $250 million. To get the money and the muscle, Rockefeller turned to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the powerful bi-state agency that controlled the region's bridges, tunnels, airports, and shipping terminals. The Port Authority was run by Austin Tobin, a Brooklyn-born lawyer who had joined the agency in 1927 and been executive director since 1942. Tobin operated the Port Authority less like a public servant and more like the CEO of a sovereign nation. He built things. He expanded the agency's empire. He resisted oversight with an aggression that bordered on contempt. When Congressman Emanuel Seller, who chaired the House Judiciary Committee, launched a congressional probe into the Port Authority's finances, Tobin refused to answer the subpoena or hand over any of the agency's books. He was convicted of contempt of Congress in 1961. The conviction was overturned on appeal the following year, and the probe was dropped. Tobin had simply waited it out. He was not a man who lost fights. The original plan put the World Trade Center on the east side near the fish market. The Radio Row merchants were all for it. It could only bring more foot traffic to their end of Lower Manhattan. Then, New Jersey's governor, Robert Minor, asked a reasonable question. What was in it for his state? New Jersey owned the ailing Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, a commuter line whose downtown terminal sat on the west side, blocks from Radio Row. The line was hemorrhaging money. Minor proposed a deal. Move the World Trade Center to the west side near the H&M terminal, and the Port Authority would take over the failing railroad. Nelson Rockefeller, David's brother and the governor of New York, agreed. The Port Authority acquired the railroad, renamed it Path, and shifted the entire project to a 16-acre site that happened to sit directly on top of Radio Row. The merchants got the news and screamed bloody murder. Their leader was Oscar Nadell, who had sold radio parts from his shop on Cortlandt Street for decades. Nadell was a natural organizer, wily with the press, and tireless in his opposition. He formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association and rallied 300 merchants and employees at a meeting near Union Square in the spring of 1962. He filed lawsuits challenging the Port Authority's use of eminent domain. He organized protests, including one memorable demonstration where he climbed into a coffin on the steps of City Hall to represent the death of Mr. Small Businessman. He quoted in every newspaper that would listen. He stood in front of television cameras and said the city was making it impossible for the small businessman to survive within its borders. When Tobin offered Nadell a storefront inside the future World Trade Center, Nadell rejected it on the spot. 2 weeks later, a group representing roughly 325 shops and 1,000 other small businesses filed an injunction. They argued that the Port Authority was using the government's power to seize private property not for a genuine public purpose, but for what amounted to a massive commercial real estate venture. In February 1963, a court ruled in their favor against the Port Authority. The agency appealed. The ruling was overturned. The merchants took it to the Supreme Court. The court declined to hear the case. Oscar Nadell and Radio Row had lost. Demolition began in March 1966. Within a year, the entire neighborhood, 4 decades of shops, thousands of jobs, a commercial ecosystem that had grown organically from a single storefront in 1921, was gone. If you visit the site today, there is nothing, not even a plaque, to mark that Radio Row ever existed. But the merchants were only the first line of opposition. The second came from much more powerful people. When the Port Authority revealed in 1964 that the World Trade Center would feature not 1 tower, but 2, each rising 110 stories, making them the tallest buildings on Earth, the real estate industry went into revolt. The plan called for 10 million square feet of new office space, roughly the equivalent of the Pan Am building and the Pentagon combined, dumped onto a market that already had 10 million vacant square feet. And because the Port Authority was a public agency, it paid no property taxes. Private developers would be competing against a government-subsidized landlord with unlimited bonding capacity and no tax burden. Lawrence Wien led the charge. Wien was a lawyer, a philanthropist, and one of the most powerful real estate investors in New York. His syndicates owned or controlled the Empire State Building, the Plaza Hotel, the Equitable Building, the Lincoln Building, and a dozen other landmarks. Wien created the Committee for a Reasonable World Trade Center and spent the next several years waging a public war. He took out full-page attack ads in every major New York newspaper. He warned that the World Trade Center would devastate the real estate market on a scale not seen since the Depression. He arranged for public hearings. He sued the Port Authority over the proposed transfer of television antenna masts from the Empire State Building to the new towers. He enlisted Harry Helmsley, Seymour Durst, and virtually every major midtown landlord. Wien's committee charged that the project was nothing more than a real estate speculation disguised as public infrastructure, that the Port Authority was building for profits to cover the Path Railroad's deficits, that the rental projections were fantasy, that the towers would cause television interference, that the streets couldn't handle the traffic, and that the buildings were simply too tall to be safe. That was the origin of the 1968 advertisement, the one with the airplane. Wien remembered all too vividly that in July 1945, a B-25 Army bomber had struck the Empire State Building, killing 14 people. He argued that towers of this height, this close to 2 major airports, posed a risk to air navigation that bordered on the unconscionable. Meanwhile, the Emergency Committee to oppose the World Trade Center formed, bringing together a different kind of opposition. Not real estate investors, but architects, historians, and urban critics. Jane Jacobs, fresh from her battle against Robert Moses's Lower Manhattan Expressway, lent her name. Louis Mumford, the great urbanist, attacked the project in print. A Harlem Citizens Alliance, led in part by a young David Dinkins, who would later become mayor, tried to get the project moved uptown, arguing that the investment should go where it was most needed. When that effort failed, the group settled for negotiating the construction of a state office building on 125th Street. One by one, every line of opposition broke against the same wall, the combined force of 2 Rockefeller brothers, the Port Authority's bonding capacity, and Austin Tobin's implacable will. The City Board of Estimate approved the project in June 1967. Construction had already begun. Now they had to find an architect. In September 1962, the Port Authority announced its selection, Minoru Yamasaki, a Japanese-American architect from Troy, Michigan, best known at the time for his design of airports, university buildings, and synagogues. He was not the most famous name in American architecture. He had beaten out more internationally renowned competitors. But Yamasaki had recently gained public attention for his design of the United States Science Pavilion at the 1962 Seattle World's Fair, a beautiful, airy structure with lacy, decorative arches that drew comparisons to the Alhambra. The Port Authority saw in him an architect who could make something elegant out of something enormous. Yamasaki was the son of Japanese immigrants raised in a Seattle tenement, and had put himself through the University of Washington by spending 5 summers working in Alaskan fish canneries for $50 a month. He had once suffered a nervous breakdown from professional stress. He was terrified of heights, and now he was being asked to design the tallest buildings in the world. He was paired with the prolific firm Emery Roth & Sons and given what amounted to an impossible task: design 10 million square feet of usable office space on a mere 16 acres of ground, with active subway tunnels running beneath the site and the Hudson River pressing in from one side. His initial concept, a cluster of smaller buildings, was rejected. Guy Tuzzoli, the Port Authority official overseeing the project, told Yamasaki that the buildings needed to be the most dramatic project in the world, a symbol of New York, nothing less. Yamasaki's response was the Twin Tower concept. His original plan called for 80-story buildings, but the math didn't work. To fit 10 million square feet onto the site, the towers would have to be 110 stories each. To make them functional at that height, Yamasaki and his engineers devised a revolutionary elevator system borrowed from the logic of the New York City subway. Express elevators that shot passengers to sky lobbies on the 44th and 78th floors, where they transferred to local elevators serving individual floors. This eliminated the need for dozens of separate elevator banks and freed up enormous amounts of usable floor space. The structural system was equally radical. Rather than relying on a traditional skeleton of interior columns, Yamasaki designed a tube frame structure, a dense grid of narrow steel columns on the building's exterior that formed a kind of exoskeleton, bearing much of the load. This gave the interiors vast, column-free, open spaces ideal for office layouts. But it also dictated the building's most distinctive and most controversial feature: narrow, slit-like windows, only 18 inches wide, set between the exterior columns. From a distance, the towers looked less like glass skyscrapers and more like solid metal slabs. The windows covered only about 30% of the exterior surface. Yamasaki, who was afraid of heights, said the narrow windows were designed to make occupants feel safe, framed rather than exposed. Critics would later say they made the occupants feel imprisoned. When the design was unveiled in January 1964, the architectural establishment reacted with something between bewilderment and horror. The American Institute of Architects criticized the aesthetics. Louis Mumford called the towers, along with other new skyscrapers of the era, just glass and metal filing cabinets. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic for the New York Times, who had initially praised the early concept as the best new building project in the city, changed her mind when she saw the final design. By the time the towers were completed, she would write that they were big buildings, but they are not great architecture, calling the whole complex the ultimate Disneyland fairy tale blockbuster and General Motors Gothic. New Yorkers developed their own shorthand. The towers were the boxes that the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building came in. Groundbreaking took place on August 5, 1966. What followed was one of the most extraordinary construction projects in American history and one of the least celebrated. The site itself was landfill. Bedrock sat 65 feet below the surface. The Hudson River was right there, pressing in from the west, and the water table was so high that workers hit water within 2 feet of digging down from street level. Before anything could be built, the entire 16-acre site had to be enclosed in a watertight retaining wall, a concrete box sunk into the earth and anchored to bedrock. The technique, called the Slurry wall method, had been pioneered in Italy, but never been used at anything approaching this scale in the United States. Workers dug trenches, filled them with a mixture of bentonite clay and water to keep the walls from collapsing, then poured concrete around steel cages to create massive reinforced panels. It took 14 months to complete the perimeter, 3,500 linear feet of wall, forming what came to be known as the bathtub. Then they began digging. Over the course of the excavation, workers pulled out 1.2 million cubic yards of earth, rock, and debris, along with cannonballs, bottles, shoes, 19th century opera playbills, business cards, an 1884 time capsule, and several ship anchors, one weighing more than 1,000 pounds. All of it was evidence of Manhattan's original shoreline, which had once run approximately where the towers would stand. The excavated material was dumped into steel cofferdams built where old piers had been torn out and burned in the middle of the Hudson. This created 23 acres of new land that would become Battery Park City, a residential neighborhood that exists today solely because the World Trade Center had to move so much earth to build its foundation. The towers rose. Steel arrived from fabrication yards in 15 states. Australian-made kangaroo cranes, diesel-powered and self-climbing, hauled themselves up the buildings as the structures grew taller. At peak construction, more than 3,500 workers were on site daily. The North Tower was topped off in December 1970 at 1,368 feet. The South Tower followed in July 1971 at 1,362 feet. The first tenants moved into the North Tower on December 15, 1970, before the building was even finished. And then came the silence. When the World Trade Center was officially dedicated on April 4, 1973, a rainy day, appropriately enough, the mood was not celebration. It was something closer to exhaustion. The governors of New York and New Jersey were present to cut the ribbon. The mayor of New York was conspicuously absent. The city was teetering toward bankruptcy. The oil crisis was throttling the economy. The project had blown past its original cost estimate of $525 million. Most estimates put the final number at around $400 million, though cost overruns and related expenditures pushed the true figure much higher. Austin Tobin, who had spent a decade fighting every opponent to make this project real, had retired the year before under pressure from New Jersey's governor. He did not attend the dedication ceremony. He would die 5 years later, in 1978, without ever seeing the buildings fully occupied. To compound the indignity, just 1 month after the dedication ceremony, the Sears Tower in Chicago topped out at 1,454 feet, surpassing the World Trade Center by nearly 100 feet. The towers had held the title of tallest buildings in the world for less than a year. Because the buildings were not fully occupied, not even close. 10 million square feet of new office space had landed on a market in recession. Rather than attracting new firms to the city, as the planners had promised, the towers pulled tenants away from other lower Manhattan offices, driving up vacancy rates throughout the entire district. The very effect Lawrence Wien had warned about was happening in real time. The towers sat partially empty for years. The solution was a subsidy dressed up as a tenant. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the same man who had approved the project, the same man whose brother had conceived it, stepped in and moved nearly all of the state's New York City offices into the towers, making the state of New York the single largest tenant in the World Trade Center. The state paid roughly $10 per square foot in rent, well below market rate. The Port Authority moved its own offices in, too. What was supposed to be the Cathedral of International Commerce had become, in its early years, a government office building. The irony was not lost on anyone. Critics noted that the project had been sold as a magnet for private trade and international business, but its biggest tenants were bureaucrats. The complex that was supposed to revitalize downtown had, in the short term, drained more economic life from the area than it created. Private developers, who had warned about exactly this, felt grimly vindicated. The towers had not attracted international trade firms to Lower Manhattan. They had simply reshuffled existing tenants and flooded the market with subsidized space. And yet, the towers were there now. They were not going anywhere. And over the next decade, something unexpected began to happen, not to the buildings themselves, but to the space around them and the people inside them. In April 1976, a restaurant opened on the 107th floor of the North Tower. It was called Windows on the World, and it was the brainchild of restaurateur Joe Baum, who had previously created the Four Seasons. Baum spent more than $17 million building it out, and the result was, against all expectations, extraordinary. The main dining room faced north and east, offering views that stretched to the Catskills on a clear day. The dress code required jackets for men. There was a wine school, an intimate supper club called Cellar in the Sky, and a bar that would eventually be renamed the greatest bar on earth. The restaurant's existence defied one of the ironclad rules of dining: never eat at the top of a tall building, and it did so by being genuinely excellent. By the year 2000, its final full year of operation, Windows on the World would report revenues of $37 million, making it the highest-grossing restaurant in the United States. Then came the first person who truly loved the towers, a Frenchman who had never been invited. On the morning of August 7, 1974, a 24-year-old wire walker named Philippe Petit stepped off the roof of the South Tower and onto a steel cable no thicker than an inch, stretched across the 140-foot gap to the North Tower, 1,350 feet above the street. He had been planning this for 6 years, ever since he read, as an 18-year-old in Paris, that 2 towers were being built in New York that would be the tallest in the world. He and a small team had smuggled hundreds of pounds of cable and rigging equipment past security by posing as construction workers, using fake building IDs obtained from a sympathetic insurance clerk who worked on the 82nd floor. They spent the night on the rooftops, rigging the wire in darkness. When dawn broke, Petit walked. He made 8 crossings. He danced. He knelt and saluted the growing crowd below. He lay down on the wire and watched a seagull circle overhead. The performance lasted 45 minutes. When he finally came in, police arrested him. The charges were dropped on the condition that he give a free tightrope show for children in Central Park. 3 years later, in May 1977, a toy maker named George Willig scaled the South Tower from the ground using the window washing tracks, a climb that took 3.5 hours as news cameras broadcasted live. Police tried to grab him partway up. He swung away. A suicide expert who reached him on a scaffold realized Willig knew exactly what he was doing and passed him a pen and paper. He signed it, "Best wishes to my co-ascender." The city fined him $1.10, 1 penny per floor. These were the moments when the towers began to change, not the buildings. The buildings were the same blunt rectangles they had always been. What changed was their meaning. Pettit and Willig had turned 2 pieces of infrastructure into landmarks of human daring. The towers had not earned affection through beauty. They had earned it through presence, the sheer, undeniable fact of them, standing there against the sky, taller than anything else, available to anyone bold enough or crazy enough to do something with them that their designers had never imagined. Slowly, reluctantly, the city began to incorporate the towers into its identity. Photographers discovered that the simple geometry of the buildings, 2 vertical lines rising from the southern tip of Manhattan, made for dramatic compositions from every angle, from the water, from the air, from Brooklyn, from New Jersey. The towers became the skyline. Not the most beautiful part of it, not the most beloved, but the most recognizable. They appeared on postcards, in movies, on the opening credits of television shows. They became what the Eiffel Tower was to Paris, the thing you could always find, the thing that oriented you, the thing that told you which way you were facing. By the 1990s, the tenant mix had transformed. The early shipping and merchant marine firms had largely been replaced by multinational banks and investment brokerages. Morgan Stanley Dean Witter occupied 22 floors of the South Tower. The complex housed more than 430 companies from 28 countries. On a typical weekday, 50,000 people worked there, and another 80,000 passed through as visitors, commuters, or shoppers in the underground mall. The occupancy rate had climbed to 98%. The towers that nobody wanted were now fully alive. Not as a trade center exactly, since few of the tenants had any real connection to port commerce, but as a dense, functioning node of the global financial system. On February 26, 1993, terrorists detonated 1,500 pounds of explosives in a van parked in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. The blast killed 6 people, injured over 1,000, and blew a hole through 4 levels of concrete substructure. The towers shook, but did not fall. The Slurry wall, the bathtub that had taken 14 months to build in the 1960s, held. Windows on the World was closed for 3 years for repairs and reopened in 1996 after a $30 million renovation. The towers survived, and in surviving they became something they had never been before: vulnerable. The 1993 bombing revealed both the building's structural resilience and the depth of the hatred directed at what it represented. For the first time, Americans began to see the World Trade Center not just as an office complex or a skyline feature, but as a target. The final chapter of the original Towers story is also the most surreal. In April 2001, the Port Authority announced that it had agreed to lease the World Trade Center to Silverstein Properties. Larry Silverstein, a billionaire real estate developer, signed a 99-year lease for $3.2 billion, the largest real estate transaction in New York City history. He put up $14 million of his own money. His partners contributed another $111 million. Banks provided the rest. The deal closed on July 24, 2001. Silverstein took possession of the complex that day. 6 weeks later, it was gone. It is difficult to write about what happened on September 11, 2001, without falling into language that has been repeated so many times it has lost its edges. But there are facts that still cut. At Windows on the World that morning, 79 employees were at work. A private breakfast event was underway in one of the banquet rooms. The first plane struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., hitting between the 93rd and 99th floors. Everyone above the impact zone was trapped. There was no way down. The second plane struck the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. The North Tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m. In total, 2,977 people were killed. When the towers fell, the Slurry wall, that 35-year-old concrete bathtub anchored to bedrock, held once more. Sections deformed, some buckled inward as much as 10 inches under the pressure of the surrounding water table. But the wall did not breach. If it had, the Hudson River would have flooded the foundation, the path tunnels, and the New York City subway system. It was the last thing the builders of the World Trade Center got right, and nobody had planned for what it was asked to endure. Here is what remains most difficult to reconcile. The Twin Towers were, by almost any objective measure, a failure of planning and a triumph of political power. They were born from one family's ambition and one agency's arrogance. They destroyed a functioning neighborhood. They flooded the real estate market. They were subsidized by taxpayers, filled with government tenants, and derided by critics for their entire existence. The architectural establishment never forgave them. New Yorkers spent 3 decades calling them ugly. In a 1987 New York Magazine survey of buildings New Yorkers love to hate, the Twin Towers placed 5th. And yet, when they were gone, the loss was not architectural. It was not economic. It was not even, in the deepest sense, political. It was the loss of a presence so massive and so constant that its absence reshaped the physical experience of being in New York. Photographers kept framing shots where the towers should have been. Commuters arriving by ferry from New Jersey looked up at a skyline that seemed to have lost its anchor. The narrow windows, those 18-inch slits that Yamasaki had designed because he was afraid of heights, that the critics had mocked, that denied the occupants panoramic views, had caught the light at sunset in a way that made the aluminum cladding glow. And now that glow was gone, and you could not get it back by building something else in the same place, no matter how many billions you spent. Nobody loved the Twin Towers until they were gone. That sentence has been repeated so many times it has become a kind of proverb, but it contains a truth that goes beyond sentiment. It captures something real about how Americans build, not by consensus, not by careful planning, not through the mechanisms of democratic agreement, but through the brute application of money, connections, and institutional power. David Rockefeller wanted to save Lower Manhattan. Austin Tobin wanted to build something monumental. Nelson Rockefeller wanted to help his brother. New Jersey wanted someone to bail out its commuter railroad. The Port Authority wanted to expand its empire. None of these motivations had anything to do with beauty or civic harmony or the small businessmen on Cortlandt Street. And the result was a pair of buildings that stood for 28 years, were hated for most of them, and were mourned with a grief that surprised even the people who felt it. Oscar Nadell, the Radio Row merchant who had lain in a coffin to protest the tower's construction, died in obscurity. His shop, his lawsuit, his coffin stunt, all of it was forgotten long before the towers themselves were destroyed. The neighborhood he fought for has no memorial. The site where Radio Row stood is now occupied by the 9/11 Memorial, two enormous square voids cut into the earth where the tower's footprints once were, with water cascading down their walls into darkness. The voids are 30 feet deep. They are the most visited memorial in the United States. Below them, beneath the plaza, the Slurry wall is still there. A portion of it is visible inside the 9/11 Memorial Museum, exposed and preserved behind glass. Visitors walk past it every day. Most of them do not know what it is. They do not know that it was built to keep the Hudson River out of a bathtub, or that it survived 2 attacks, or that it is the oldest continuous structure on the site, older than the towers, older than Radio Row's demolition, older than the idea of a World Trade Center itself. The wall predates everything that happened above it, and it is still doing the only job it was ever asked to do, holding back the water, keeping the ground from giving way. The narrow windows are gone. The filing cabinets are gone. The boxes that the Empire State Building came in are gone. What remains is a hole in the sky where 2 rectangles used to be, and a wall underground that nobody planned to make permanent, and the quiet, persistent fact that in America the things we build by force sometimes become the things we cannot bear to lose.